Yes, we are
I
live now.
thank you. So we are starting our live session, which is a broadly 2 days session dealing with issues of racism, issues of labor laws, and a lot of humanitarian crisis that has come into the picture, followed by the COVID-19 crisis that is ongoing. And the today's talk, the assault of labor during times of crisis, labor law changes and what it means for the working class, largely would be dealing on the issues of labor laws, regulations in India, and followed by recent state governments like Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, Punjab, Odisha, these state governments deregulating the labor laws and as an it's an assault on the democratic rights of the workers. And today's speaker had been associated with Student Federation of India from his earlier student days at Jawaharlal Nehru University, and now he's a postdoctoral scholar at Azim Premji University, the Center for Sustainable Employment. And we'll start in now the talk, and followed by the discussion by Comrade Paarithosh. We'll be taking few questions, and even after that, we can come back to a few of the issues if there's a need of discussion on a more detailed. So I'll hand it over to Comrade Paarithosh to start with, and thank you all for joining in this session. Comrade Paarithosh.
Thank you, Soham. First of all, I would like to thank the Students Federation of India that they gave me this opportunity to speak about a very important topic in today's times, which is the changes or the dilution, or rather the attack on the working class that has come about, especially during the times of COVID-19. So, I first of all, I would like to welcome all of you, and I would hope all of you are safe and are doing well during this unprecedented times. And it is during this unprecedented times that what we see in terms of our policy discourse is that the government is behaving in a manner as if nothing really has changed. We've seen those images of migrant workers, hundreds and thousands of migrant workers walking. There is no sort of conveyance for them. They don't know what to do. They have been completely left to their own by the state. But in terms of policy discourse, none of that seems to actually be a concern. So whatever was being projected before this lockdown took place as the remedy to, the solution to our economic crisis, during the lockdown and after the lockdown, it is the very same things that are being propagated. So this entire discussion of labor laws or changes in labor regulations, this is not a new thing. It's been, I mean, especially it's been going on for many years now. And there have been bits and pieces or processes that the ruling class has attempted to change labor laws throughout. And what we see now is a direct assault, and they use this COVID-19 as an opportunity. They themselves say that, there was an article which came out in a leading daily where they said that you should use a good crisis to your advantage. I mean, that is the term they use during a time when most workers don't really have any source of work or job right now. And this is the time where a certain agenda needs to be put forth. And labor laws becomes the center piece of it. So for today's discussion, what I will do is I will broadly talk about the labor law changes that have taken place in three states, which is Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, and Uttar Pradesh. And instead of going through a very detailed analysis of what actually has taken place in terms of labor regulation and its shifts, I would be talking about some of the broader arguments that were coming in, wherein how the justifications that have come in support of these labor laws, and how this is not the solution in terms of the crisis that we see in front of us right now. Secondly, and I think this is a more important question because the reasons or the justifications why some of these arguments are irrational, again, they're also not a new thing. People from the left and other progressive sections of society have been arguing that this is not the way forward. But it is now also time to realize what exactly has brought about this shift? Because as I said before, up till 2013-14, we saw that a lot of labor laws were being changed from the back door. There were talks and there were murmurs amongst policy circles that we need to change labor laws. Ever since the second National Commission on Labor, which was somewhere in the early 2000s, this demand had been coming about from industry that we need to change our labor laws, but nothing actually took place. It is only with the coming of the present regime in the last 5 to 6 years that we see that there has been a frontal approach, and there is an aggressive approach in terms of the state stating that we do not care anymore, we will take this assault on labor because there are larger considerations, and then they sort of envelope it in the discourse of nationalism and everything which is there, and thus the COVID crisis. So when this entire pandemic was taking place, people were under lockdown, people who had no source of income, people who had lost their jobs, the argument came in that there is a need to boost up our economy, and to boost our economy, what do we need? We need to change labor regulations. So as I mentioned before, the states of Uttar Pradesh, Gujarat and Madhya Pradesh went ahead and carried out some labor regulations or labor law changes, and certain arguments were brought forward. I will go into the specificities of what changes actually took place, but let's see some of the arguments, because the migrant crisis, which is also a topic for the next 2 days when we're discussing about migrant labor. In fact, there was an article which came out which talked about the Migrant Workmen Act and said, this is a clear example that labor laws are too stringent in our society, and they came from a era where the state gave too much of leeway to labor, and these labor regulations might have their heart in the right place, but paradoxically they lead to the worsening conditions of the workers of this country. Now this is the argument given. What does this argument sort of entail? It says that the cost of hiring workers is really high in this country because of the labor laws that are there in place, and this is why employers, they cannot afford to hire laborers in the formal sector. So what do? They circumvent or bypass these laws, and thus you find a large proliferation or a large number of people who are employed with low working condition, like very poor working condition, low wages. We have the proliferation of the informal sector. So these are some of the arguments that are given, and so let's try to break this particular aspect of the labor laws. So to begin with, and something which intuitively I think all of us, it is the first thing which comes into our minds, is that if today the capitalists or the ruling classes can easily circumvent or bypass these laws, how is it that if we remove whatever laws still remain, how will that lead to a betterment of the working conditions? Because we see that the legal bodies which are there, the state bodies which are there, they've already sort of been molded in a way that capital today can already bypass the various stringent regulations. And the answer to that is that we need to do away with whatever protects the workers. On the question of the cost of workers, and let me talk about the organized manufacturing sector, which is probably the one sector in this country where some labor laws do operate. And this is coming from government data, this is not something I have cooked up in the air, but the annual survey of industries data, what they do is they give us an idea, or a ratio of the share of wages to the total output in the coming from the organized manufacturing sector. This was around 29% in 1980, and it has fallen to around 12% in 2015-16. So as per the government data itself, the labor costs are not only low in this country, but they have been falling continuously. And okay, so they talk a lot about investment agencies and how they perceive labor in India. So there's this one investment agency called Genimex, and according to their own report, they said that in 2014 the average cost of manufacturing labor per hour in India was around 92 cents, whereas they compared it with China, and we have a tendency of comparing, like in the public policy discourse, of comparing it with China. They said that labor costs in China were around $4 per man-hour. So clearly, low labor cost is actually a reality in this country. The report also mentioned that investment in India should be taken with a pinch of salt because we have high power costs, we have high transportation costs, there are a lot of infrastructural costs which are there, and yet, in our policy discourse and argument, these factors which might reduce India's competitiveness, even under the neoclassical or mainstream framework, is never really looked at or never taken into account. The burden of the poor performance of the economy is placed directly on labor. There is another argument, and this was Shekhar Gupta in his piece brought it out, and it's been a long-standing argument, and it pertains to inspections. So what they say is that there is this inspection raj in India, which leads to high compliance cost and a lot of corruption. Now, what does this inspection raj, or what is this argument? This argument is that there is a lot of corruption in the labor department. So what they do is that they tend to seek rents, or in lieu of clearing the inspection criteria for different investments or different industrialists, they ask for some bribes, they ask for money. So they basically, industrialists are getting blackmailed today, and this is disinvesticizing investment. So the solution, and this is something which is hilarious, that the solution that is provided is that let's just do away with the law. Now let's take another analogy over here. Law and order in this country, right? There is some amount of corruption in the entire institution of law and order, but nobody ever gives the argument that let's just do away with the courts, or let's just do away with any police force. There are traffic rules, there are still accidents in this country, but nobody says that, oh, accidents are happening, so what's the point of traffic rules? Let's do away with it. And it's absurd that labor is the one aspect where the blame again is put on it, on workers, that, oh, there is corruption in government departments, so the government will not try to check corruption in their own department, but they will try to remove the entire gamut of labor laws. I mean, and this is actually a failure of the government to regulate any sort of a check mechanism in their own inspection offices, but now labor is at fault. So, and also empirically, if you were to look at the data which is coming in again from government sources, under the Factories Act, the inspection rate in 1985 was around 63% across the country. In 2011, it had fallen to 13%. So only 13% of the factories that needed to be inspected were actually inspected under the Factories Act. I'll throw you another number. In the year 2013, and again, government data, in Bihar, there was one officer who was in charge of 1,060 factories in the state, in the region where that particular officer needed to go and inspect. So the problem is corruption in the department and a very low inspectorate staff. So what you actually need to be doing to, getting rid of these high compliance costs is trying to check on corruption. B is trying to increase the size of your inspectors, but you wouldn't do that. And then there is the third argument, which is the most popular argument, and the argument which has probably driven these present circumstances, is that we need simplicity in our regulations. And just let me give you a background that in the past 4 to 5 years, the government has been trying to come up with four major labor codes. So what they're trying to do, and this is at the central level, that they are trying to collapse 44 major central laws surrounding the condition of labor into four main codes, right? And one of the arguments given is that we have too many laws. It becomes a legal hassle even for workers. It's difficult to sort of pinpoint or to accurately assess which law they come under. Or there could be a situation where there is one law which says something and a second law which directly contravenes it. So workers are caught in a legal tussle. So what do we need? We need simplicity of laws, right? We could go with that argument. For one, we could say, all right, there could be an argument that maybe some labor laws, there needs to be far more clearer definitions. But what are the changes that these three state governments have done? And let me just take 2 minutes to explain. The government of Uttar Pradesh brought out an ordinance, right? According to that ordinance, for the next 3 years, 35 out of the 38 labor laws that are applicable in the state of Uttar Pradesh have been done away with. So, what are the acts which remain? One is the Bonded Labor System Abolition Act. The second one is the Employees Compensation Act. And the third one is the Building and Other Construction Workers Act. There are some provisions which relate to the employment of women and children, which are still there. But the acts, some of the major crucial acts, such as the Factories Act, the Industrial Disputes Act, the Trade Unions Act, the Contract Labor Act, the Maternity Benefits Act, the Minimum Wages Act, all of these acts have been done away with, right? Coming to Madhya Pradesh, and I'll come to the simplicity argument once I explain the changes that have come about in these three states. The Madhya Pradesh Industrial Relations Act, which basically allowed trade unions to be a recognized negotiator when it came to industrial disputes. So, if workers are in a conflict with the management, the Madhya Pradesh Industrial Relations Act actually recognized trade unions as a party which could come in and try to negotiate on behalf of the workers. It is no longer applicable to 11 major industries in Madhya Pradesh. I mean, as per the ordinance. So, cement, automobile, textiles, right, steel, some of the major industries, they have actually done away with any role that the trade union would play. The Factories Act, which is one of the most broad act when it comes to defining the conditions of work on the factory floor, has been done away with. However, they've kept certain sections. So the sections relating to the licensing of firm has been kept in, right? The section relating to some safety of workers have been kept in. The section related to overtime has been kept, and there is another section which deals with annual leave with wages has been kept in. So there were mainstream journalists who actually took the example of Madhya Pradesh and compared it with Uttar Pradesh and said, "Oh, look, Uttar Pradesh has just gone, has taken things a step too far. Look at Madhya Pradesh; they've been smart about it. They've changed certain things, but they have tried to keep the welfare of the workers into check. Whether that happens, I mean, we shall see." There's another thing that the state of Madhya Pradesh has done. So they have come up with this understanding that for the next 1,000 days, roughly 3 years, the factories which are going to be set up, so for the next 1,000 days, any new factory which is going to be set up is going to be exempted from, the Industrial Disputes Act. Now, what is the Industrial Disputes Act? And this has been a long, contentious act in when it comes to the labor policy and discourse. What this act does is that if I'm an industrialist today and I want to fire a worker, right, and I have a certain limit in terms of like minimum I employ either 100 or in some states 300 workers. If I have to retrench a single worker, I need to go ahead and take the permission of the local labor commissioner. It's chapter 5B of the Industrial Disputes Act, right? That provision has been done away with. So now what this new regulation does is that it allows new firms to, they don't need up any permission for laying off workers. There is still a provision for retrenching workers that you need to take permission, but laying off workers, and in industrial in the industrial parlance, there is a difference between laying off and retrenchment. Retrenchment is that you are taken out of your job. Laying off is that for the next 6 to 8 or 11 months, however the factory might look upon it, the factory can say, okay, we don't have work anymore, you can go and seek work elsewhere, and then we can take you back. At the time of this corona or this COVID crisis, where people's savings are minimal, at a time when people have no source of income coming in, if you effectively lay off people, they won't stick around to wait for better times to come or achhe din to come, and then wait for the factories to take them back. Most of these people either would migrate back to their homes, or they would like to look for other avenues. So what this amendment has effectively done is that it has allowed factories to retrench workers, not in the nature of the law or the spirit of, not in the letter of the law, but in terms of its effectiveness. And now they don't need to take any government permission. There is another act which is called the Industrial Employment Standing Orders Act, which the total size, they have the number, the size criteria has been increased to 100 workers. What does the Industrial Employment Standing Orders Act do? basically when a person starts a factory, they need to set down the rules and conditions by which work would operate and the terms of employment. They send it to a signing authority. The signing authority gives it to the workers or the local trade union which might represent those workers, and there is a mutual agreement. Why was this act brought in? So that there is some parity amongst different factories operating in a region, that we know what is a permissible level of work which could be allowed. Earlier, it was applicable to any factory employing above 20 workers. That threshold has been increased to 100 workers. So if I employ 99 workers today, I could, subject them to the most terrible working conditions, but legally they really cannot challenge me because um, I don't come under the purview of this act. Gujarat has done a similar exercise. This new factories phenomena has also been, captured in Gujarat, where they have also removed all labor laws except the Minimum Wages Act, the Employees Compensation Act, and some safety related rules for the next 1200 days. So there was a lot of numbers right now, but let me just bring it down in concise terms. Uttar Pradesh has done away with the majority of its laws. Gujarat has done away with the majority of its laws. Madhya Pradesh has done away with some major, acts, but retained certain sections. And this is where the problem of this simplicity argument comes in. Because this bizarre decision of, removing entire acts, save for a couple of sections. So, for example, the second section of the Factories Act has been done away with. What does the second section do? It informs, or it, as per law, it defines who is a worker, who is an owner, and what is a production process. It's absolutely ridiculous that that section has been done away with, but certain sections have been kept in place. But for example, there's been a section which has been kept in place which looks at the injury. If a worker is injured during the production process, there is some compensation requirement. But if you no longer define who a worker is or what is a production process, what would effectively happen is that a firm owner will say, well, this person got injured, but he's not a worker as far as I recognize it. He might be a temp, or he might be, contracted out, or she might be contracted out to someone else. And the work they were doing was not a core function of this production manufacturing process. And legally, there is no way to challenge that. So that worker would be denied, of any sort of a compensation. The Madhya Pradesh government also brought in overtime. They said we will retain overtime. Problem is the section of the Factories Act which defines what is the permissible, legally permissible limit of the number of hours that one can work in a day, that has been done away with. So what is this? This overtime becomes abstract. Let me just explain this a bit more. In today's times, as per the current law, you can only work for a maximum of 48 hours in a week and around 8 to 9 hours per day. This thing is defined under particular section of the Factories Act, right? Anything above that, so if I work for 12 hours, right, but the maximum legal stipulation is 9 hours, the other 3 hours are considered overtime. So for an hourly wage, you are paid, twice or 1.5 times what is your regular wage. But now there is no definition of what is overtime. So 12 hours could be, a regular working day. 13 hours could be a regular working day. 8 hours could be a regular working day. So this particular section which they've retained becomes null and void. And another thing which they did was that they took annual leaves, right? And they said any worker, so the annual leave section of the Factories Act is still there. According to this annual leave section, any worker who has worked for at least 240 days in the factory can take leave, and the factory owner will have to pay them money. But we don't now know how the factory will, define a worker, because that section has been taken away. There was another section, which was section 62, which talked about maintaining registers within the factory. That has been done away with. So today, there is no way a worker can prove to a factory owner or even in a court of law that, hey, I worked for 240 days in that factory, because those things have been done away with. The factory owner will say, I did not keep any record because I'm not legally bound to keep any records, right? So this is that sort of, backhand way in which seemingly, concerns for labor are, when they say that, oh, we've kept all those sections which look at labor and seek to, justify or seek to, protect their interests, it doesn't matter because the main portions of the act has already been done away with. The UP government, for example, it keeps the act which deals with, the amount of compensation a worker would get if there is an accident on a factory floor, but it does away with the act which defines what safety measures or regulations need to be put in the factory floor to begin with. So again, the liability is absolutely off the owner's heads, because the owner would always say, well, I didn't know that we need to put a rail in that thing because the Factory Act has not, is no longer is no longer applicable. So this entire, the legal tussle with this case would continue. So all this talk, all these people talking about we need simplicity, we need, clear labor laws, what I see or what we've been trying to look at is that these changes would make the entire process even far more complex. And this aspect of Gujarat and Madhya Pradesh coming up with, two parallel sets. So factories which are currently in operation work under the old laws. There are new factories which will work under new laws. So a worker, generally under a contractor, switched around from one factory to another, uh, there are two parallel laws for the same, legal benefit or legislation operating in the same state. This is going to lead to a barrage of, legal disputes. It's going to lead to far more hassles. And the third argument, so the first argument, which was about high labor cost, was shown to be ineffective. The second argument, which was about, that there is an inspectorate raj and, corruption is there, that can be resolved through just checking government departments. And the third one, which is about simplicity, that really is not the objective of what this government wants to do. So what is the objective? It seems that there is a process to bring, the entire workforce down to the lowest common denominator. So in all three states, the hire and fire practices, the Industrial Disputes Act, which I was talking about, has been done away with. The Trade Unions Act in all three places, and in Madhya Pradesh, the Industrial Relations Act has been done away with. So there is a very conscious effort to, completely disenfranchise and completely weaken any organized working class movement in the name of, growth, in the name of progress for the country. Um, this is a problem. Another thing which all these, in terms of this lowest common denominator, which all these states try to do, and something I've alluded to before, was that they want to now increase the amount of working time in the, on the factory floor. So all three of them have done away with any legal section which tries to check the number of hours a worker would work in. The problem is that if anyone, and I'm sure a lot of you, working with SFI or other organizations, have been in touch with, workers, have been constantly, part of the movement, and you realize that in a lot of factories, nobody really sticks to that 8 hour or a 9 hour norm per day. They generally work for a longer time. And the PLFS data, which is the government data, it also informs us that wage workers, and this is in the organized best manufacturing sector, work for an average of 60 hours in a week, with only 7% of that workforce working for less than 55 hours, right? So already the amount of people who work more than the legal requirement is quite large. So what happens in a factory floor generally is that if I work for 9 hours and then I work for 2 extra hours, those two extra hours, and I've explained it again, was given as overtime. Now you just increase the length of the working day, make it a legal rule. So in reality, you are not only legalizing extensive hours of backbreaking work, but whatever little monetary incentive those workers could have got, working beyond those 8 to 9 hours, that has also been done away with. They will just get a regular wage. So if my regular wage is 60 rupees an hour, and because of overtime I used to get 120 rupees an hour for those 3 hours, now as per these new laws I'll only get 60, 60, 60. I'll just get 60 rupees an hour, right? Another thing which has happened, and all of this is happening when certain provisions of the Factories Act have been done away with. So no longer any factory is required to keep a restroom. There is no need to keep a washroom. Creches are no longer required. So earlier, under the Factories Act, if you have a female workforce beyond a certain size, you need to keep creches available. that's no longer required anymore, which would also dissuade women from participating in the industrial workforce. And to bring, and this is like the final point that I would want to bring about, because this is the key argument which a lot of people make surrounding all of these discussions, which is the argument on labor aristocracy. So whenever we talk about labor rights, whenever we talk about the rights, I mean how it is important to have these labor laws, to defend these labor laws, a lot of people would give an argument saying, well, these labor laws only are applicable to a small minority of workers, right? Which whom they call the labor aristocracy. And they say it's better that whatever benefits can be accrued should be distributed amongst the masses, or the larger informal or every sort of a workforce, and we do away with these this tight guarded labor aristocracy which is there. Now, a couple of points. First of all, this word aristocracy, we did some data analysis with the annual survey of industries, and even those sectors which do carry or do employ this supposed labor aristocracy, we found a high contract density. Basically, a large section of that workforce is contractual workforce, which doesn't come under this labor aristocracy benefits which are there. 48% of work in the organized manufacturing sector is of an informal type. 80% of workers who are in the organized manufacturing sector do not have a written contract. 62% of workers in the organized manufacturing sector are not eligible for paid leave. If this is the category of workers you think is an aristocrat, I would really want you to go back and consult your basic dictionary, because this is just people who are getting a bare minimum above what are subsistence levels. And the idea, this notion, and that you pit the labor aristocracy against other workers and say, oh well, they're doing better, these people are the reasons why, or this section is the reason why workers are not benefiting. It is ridiculous, because nobody is actually doing that well. I mean, we're in a very poor low road of development in our society. And according to the PLFS, which is again a government data source, 45% of regular workers earn less than 10,000 rupees per month. And now you're saying these regulatory frameworks are to blame? Mind you, also remember that the organized sector, or what we call this labor aristocracy, or the benefits that they have acquired today, has, it's not come from above, or there is no finite set that the capitalist says, okay, you can get these benefits. It's been through a constant and hard fought labor struggle which has been there, and it is because of that that some sections of the workforce have managed to gain benefits. So moving forward, encapsulating all of the different data, the different arguments that we have put in, and putting it into the context of today's times, right? Today, we are faced with a scenario where even before the coronavirus hit in, we had the highest unemployment rates in the last 45 years, right? There was, in fact, we did a study, and we calculated around 9.9 million workers lost their jobs in absolute terms between 2011 and 12 and 2017 and 18. So it's been like a far, I mean, we've never had this scenario when in absolute terms people are losing their jobs, right? And then comes this coronavirus. At the Center for Sustainable Employment, where I'm currently working, we did this telephonic survey, and it was for it was we looked at, I mean, we approached different partner organizations, and we did a purposive sampling of the situation of work during, or the situation of livelihood or impact on livelihood because of this coronavirus and lockdown, in fact. And we found, and this is a very specific sample set, but we found that two-thirds of our respondents, we spoke to around 5,000 people, and around two-thirds of our respondents have lost their employment, right, during this period. Earnings have fallen massively, right? Not, I mean, a very large section of people have not received any form of cash transfer. So this, in this scenario where we see that there is people's incomes or income making opportunities are lost, we see that there is a severe demand shortage in the economy, right? Because people don't have money. We see those images which I mean, it's extremely disturbing about those helpless workers, who were also part of, probably were part of the factories at one point of time, the supposed, labor aristocracy, walking for miles, walking, somehow trying to reach back home. And to take away whatever feeble benefits that legally they were supposed to get, it's a humanitarian crime at levels unprecedented, because you already have a demand squeeze, that I don't have any earnings, or it's been really hard because of the corona lockdown, I've had to take loans from people, I don't have enough money to even survive a week, so I needed to take loans. Now you're telling them, well, when it comes to your healthcare, when it comes to these other provisions, we are no longer going to bear responsibility, which means that workers will have to spend more out of their pockets, which was legally the responsibility of either the state or of the capitalist class. So, and if that happens, your demand is going to be constricted even more. So, how is this entire exercise of doing away with the labor laws going to bring about any sort of benefit? I mean, it's going to lead to a larger precarity of the workforce. I mean, there are very scary times ahead, and we've been arguing today that workers should get some cash transfer. There should be schemes set up. Like Kerala had a very good example a couple of years back, 2 years back, in fact, where they restarted employment in the public sector. So their entire cashew nut industry was started again. So there is an economic question, but there is also a question of political will. Whether you're willing to allow, state agencies to employ more and more people, whether you're willing to have an urban employment scheme of sorts, whether you're willing to say no, we can't subject our workforce to such, despicable conditions, but we would have certain provisions there in place for you. And that is how some aspect or some level of growth can be achieved. And with this one last point, which I would want to specify, and I will close with this, is that what do we do? Like all of us from sections which are concerned about this, it is time to not get caught up in these divisions. This is a formal worker, this is an aristocrat worker, this is that worker, this is that worker, but to realize that there are also a lot of commonalities of experience. A lot of regular wage workers have also lost their employment. The way in which value is extracted from workers on a factory floor is very similar to the way value is extracted from you know uh, uh, ad hoc teachers. Delhi University, for example, ad hoc teachers, they have to continuously renew their contract after 6 months. They are subject to extreme number of hours of work. Their pay is far less. So it is time for these sections to understand, okay, we're also facing the same thing as the worker on the industrial floor. The industrial floor workers also have to understand about different dimensions, permutations, and combinations of and not to get caught up with just saying, okay, we will talk about migrant workers here, or we will talk about informal workers here, but to see what sort of a labor movement can be built where we take everyone forward and demand for a better society. So I would end with that. Thank you so much for giving me an opportunity. There was a time constraint and I tried to pack as many things possible. But if there are any questions regarding those laws, please let me know. Thank you.
Uh, Thanks a lot, Comrade Paarithosh. This has been quite an insightful talk from your side, and we are opening the session now for questions to come, and we can have a further discussion on things that are to be elaborated. And there are many issues that you have touched upon, and you have compacted those in very short amount of time. So I myself, while listening to it and the way you started, it seems as if the government is continuously attacking the, what you have said, a humanitarian crime. It seems that the dignity of human lives are under continuous attack during when this pandemic has started. And right now, if we see that the student activists are being silently taken to the like in Delhi and elsewhere, silently taken to the police custodies, and they are being held there. The labor laws are, as if, since there are no provisions to wage struggles against all of these, uh, it has given opportunities largely to the BJP-led states to assault on these democratic rights provided to the uh, uh, workers like very minuscule amount of rights, even though that is being taken away right now. So as a progressive organization, since SFI is organizing it, how do you think that in as you have indicated a direction that maybe a larger mobilizations without irrespective of the status of work, how do you think that new mobilization should come? Because it's a time, unprecedented time, and it has been like the labor rights have been under attack. So, what would be the broad common minimum we can look forward to in order to wage struggles to get back our workers' rights? And
So yeah, so two things. So I'll take the first thing first. It was a very interesting point that you raised, that this is also the time where a lot of political activists who were arguing about whether it be the anti-CAA NRC protest, whether it be anything else, they themselves, people who have been in fact victims of the sort of riots, they themselves have now been branded as perpetrators or responsible for it. And it's the same analogy which we see with labor, the labor which is today extremely subjected to really harsh working conditions. A lot of them have been rendered, as I said, unemployed. They are now seen, and the labor laws which are supposed to benefit them are seen as responsible for their deplorable conditions. So this exercise of seeing victims as perpetrators is nothing new, and a lot of student activists over here would identify with that, and that has been the specific nature of the government's policy, or this modus operandi, that whoever is tries to speak against us, or we try to assault them, will eventually, whether it be in the case of, for example, mob lynching, the cases against Akhlaq's family, the people who suffer the most, they have actual cases against them, and this is the broader trajectory in which things are going. In terms of mobilizations, often we use terms of there being new creative ways of thinking, and yes, I agree, there needs to be there needs to be broader solidarities which are built across. There needs to be recognition on different aspects, because labor across is suffering, so there needs to be a recognition across different categories that our cause is the same, but we should come together. But I would also say that we should also go back to some of our traditional ways of organizing, mobilizing the workforce, in terms of concentrated trade unions. So a very interesting fact I learned a couple of days back, in fact, was that the CITU, in fact, two-thirds of its membership is the unorganized sector. Yet always the blame comes on to the trade unions by other people, that oh, you only look at the labor aristocracy or the organized sector. But you see, trade unions are slowly recognizing this fact and trying to build people together. The objective of students or young activists is to also recognize that this hierarchy of labor that we create in our heads, I mean, we are all suffering under the same system. So there needs to be concrete mobilization taken up to bring it together. So there'll be new avenues. Somebody has just written, yes, there'll be new avenues of this gig economy work, but which was celebrated quite a bit. But now we see what's happening. I mean, it's coming back. So how do how do you unionize these areas? Or Karnataka, and Soham and I both are from Bangalore, so we know that the IT workers, slowly how there is a move to unionize IT workers. I think those are steps we need to take, with a recognition that our cause is the same.
the question also largely deals with that. The question that has come, that we have seen many youth joining in Ola, Uber, etc. But during lockdown, they are also left completely unattended and jobless. How can we be organizing them? Uh,
Right. So this entire fascination which came in with the gig economy, right, and it was celebrated, and there have been legislations even in the United Kingdom and other places where there has been a dispute whether they're workers, or they are employers, or they're self-employed. I think it's time where members of the organized trade unions, and there is a more proactive effort in trying to push for this, both at a legal as well as a political agenda, to recognize them as workers, and to say that if you're a taxi driver, whether it's a form like a classical taxi union, or if it's an Ola system, at a broader level we are not willing to negotiate or budge down from certain basic minimums, right? So there's this technological fascination that just because you have an app and it sort of gives you a driver and you don't face to face work with your employer, suddenly you're free from all of that. It's not that. They're also subject to extremely poor work conditions, uh, extremely harsh working hours, and this is a golden opportunity to organize them. So yeah, I don't think we should ignore them. And they have been left completely unattended and jobless. And there is a debate whether this is actually an opportunity for the trade unions to pick up the speed and try to bring all of these sections together.
Right. As of now, we have only that question, and no, another question that has come is women labor is undervalued and discriminated in most of the organized sector, leave apart the domestication part and the unpaid labor part of it. How do you see that in view of the discussion that we are having?
Yes, so I mean the entire aspect. So as I spoke about in UP, the Maternity Benefits Act has been done away with, right? Very important. Even the Equal Compensation Act. I mean, it is preposterous that the Equal Compensation Act, which tries to bring about some parity of wage pay for the same amount of work between men and women, that has been done away with. And historically, yes, it's true that the women's labor has been completely undervalued, and there is this entire debate about what is actually an economic productive activity. Do surveys such as the NSSO or the PLFS actually identify these things? But even in the formal sector, these changes, in fact, I think would push women out of the labor force as we see it. And that's been happening since the last 6 years. The employment fall that I spoke to between 11, 12, and 17, 18 was because of women leaving the workforce. And this particular thing will also, as the question points out, in the organized sector, we do see that this will take place because if there are no crash facilities, for example, or the Factories Act stipulated there'll be different washrooms for men and women in a factory place which has a certain number. That has been done away with very clearly, where how certain types of work is completely being sort of pushed aside.
And the following question deals with something that you start with, Paarithosh, that a narrative that doing away of labor laws has to do with attracting investments as wages in China are getting expensive. And there's also an ongoing trade war being waged by the US government against Chinese farms. So there's a lot of speculation in investment banking sector as well. In this scenario, is this suspension of labor laws has anything to do with the larger picture of shifts in global political economy, or is it specific to our domestic affairs to bring investments in terms of?
The objective is at one level to bring in investments, but I really don't see whether uh, sorry, I really don't see whether that has actually taken place or not, because this entire fascination of let's get the investment right, and the confidence of the investors need to be placed in. Look at the amount of FDI which is coming in the country, and how much of it is actually in greenfield investment, which is leads to a creation of any fruitful jobs. Most of the money which is coming in is used for mergers and acquisitions, so that is one issue. When it comes to this question of diluting labor laws, there is already a narrative set into place that, uh, you know, what we tend to offer as part of either Make in India or any other objective is a very cheap, compliant workforce. And so when we get incorporated in the global value chains, we have very cheap labor to offer over here. We've seen instances across the globe where you could still invite, I mean, if that is the direction in which you're going in, you could still invite capital coming in, but you need not, sell off, an absolute minimum of labor rights as your basic USP or the point which needs to go across. I mean, you could have better working conditions for workers, at the same time having some level of investment. And why to just restrict your imagination to that? As I again said, the public sector investing in a large scale for bringing about employment, I mean, that somehow seems to be an established fact that that cannot happen. What is the empirical basis of that, or what is the historical experience of that, never is given. Are you there, Swam?
Right. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So, as you were saying, that the economy was already in a downturn prior to the COVID crisis. The government has been trying to do away with the labor laws in the form of codes that has been already been in place, and some of the states are bringing it. How do you think that even if we are going to able to do away with the lockdown for and the regular economic activities start taking place, how do you see that the unemployment scenario that has already been in a dire situation of employment that has already been in the place, does doing away with the labor laws give any hope that even without the minimum security of getting a decent work, is there any possibility that there will be any employment opportunities being provided by these states, or is there a chance of opening up of employment opportunities if these laws are being done away with?
So there has been that long-standing, debate, and I'm pretty sure you're familiar with that, about labor market flexibility and how it leads to, employment generation. There were a lot of works. For example, Pranab Bardhan in a 2014 paper argued that these labor law changes has no real effect on employment growth. Right? If you make it far more flexible, so employment growth. There is another article which came out a couple of years back by the VV Giri Institute, where they actually looked at some changes which were brought in the state of Uttar Pradesh a couple of, a decade back. And it was brought in to state that, oh, this would lead to a rise of employment opportunities. It really did not take place. So the reason why employment is actually established in a place and it grows has a lot of historical factors behind it. It also requires a lot of government investment. And most studies, even studies which, from the neoclassical or mainstream processes which use extensive modeling to arrive at it, they're very inconclusive and really do not present us a picture which we can say for confidence that if you do away with everything, more employment generation is actually going to take place. Now, this is a contested thing, I understand. So there will also be studies which will say things to the contrary. But broadly, we have not really seen this labor market flexibility as being the single key issue which restricts employment growth in our country. In fact, a lot of employment growth which took place as per the annual survey of industries between 2005 and 6 to 2010 and 11, we actually saw a rise in employment activities in the organized manufacturing sector. But if you look at the condition of work which was actually being generated, was of a very precarious, informal type, which was brought about. So that is the reality of the workplace today.
And which brings us to that the government has decided to sell off many PSUs as response to the lockdown, and taking for like the reason given as the taking care of the economy. And you have just now mentioned that the jobs that were being created were in organized manufacturing. So how do you think that that is going to further affect the working class?
So, as the thing I started with, in fact, this particular talk was the argument that whatever was being projected as the Achhe model, even before the Corona crisis came in, is actually now being sold to us as the solution to this crisis. So the PSUs being sold off, time and time again, and suddenly, in the midst of all of this, where across the world we see a greater investment in the public sector, or a realization that a public sector is a very integral part of the economy, we have this current government which is absolutely fine with selling off PSUs, public sector employment. And PSUs, I mean, in fact, do any sort of the number of surveys which have come about, PSUs are that last standing place where at least your some sort of an employment benefit or security is still retained. So, and that would be some source of demand which would still remain in your economy. Doing away with that, it's just, it doesn't make either an economic sense, and in terms of a broader political logic, it's very scary what that actually means when the state is willing to risk all of this, in the name of development, and is willing to risk the future of the working class in this manner in the name of development. An alternative, as I said, there are different models. I mean, Kerala, again, I keep on going back to it, but a model where factories which had been closed down were opened up again by the government. So I think that there are alternatives. We just need to have a political imagination for this.
And I think we are in the 55 minutes of it. So
Okay.
Yeah, so Will, thank you. Thanks a lot, Comrade. This has really been insightful, and at a time, as you have correctly pointed out, where like our we have been isolated by the lockdown, and things have become really gloomy at times. Things have seems bleak at times, and it's also talking about the labor rights in the year when this is CITU's 50th year, I think, and I think we need to revisit the role of organized politics. And as it has come out from the discussions that we have had with you today, it reiterates the fact that there is a need for organized and people's movement in order to bring back the workers' rights, those are in place. And I sincerely thank all the audiences, friends, comrades, those who have joined here for the talk. And tomorrow also there is another talk on the racism and in the current US scenario, and the how things have been in US. And please do join at 7 p.m. in the SFI CEC page. And I once again thank Comrade Paarithosh and SFI CEC for organizing this talk. Thank you.
Thank you.